Reform obviously has had an awful lot to say on immigration, but on to the extent it has an economic policy, has in some respects planted itself what you might say is way to the left of Labour.
It's within the last 3.5 years that Boris Johnson was giving talks about how he had plans for a third term as Prime Minister. So a lot can change.
Instead of looking back and being frustrated at the public services, the issues, the problems that they inherited, they're looking forward to the competition in the future. And they see that competition as not with the Conservatives, but with Reform.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Well, today we're talking about the party conferences. The Labour Party conference looking a bit ahead to the Conservative one. We'll be talking about the mood at Labour, about Reform, the party that wasn't there but was in every speech, it seemed like, about immigration, about foreign policy, does it matter, and indeed about the country's finances, which do matter, and the parties are wrestling with how to talk about it. I'm joined by Pollster Joe Twyman, who's co-founder and director of Delta Poll, and Olivia O'Sullivan, who runs our UK in the World programme. Let's start straight off. You were both there. What was the mood like?
Well, I would describe it as fine. Not great, not as miserable as last year, but at the same time probably better than some people had expected.
Last year was miserable, surprisingly. They were in the row about who was paying for their clothes and about the very downbeat start that Keir Starmer had had.
Yes, I would say that last year could be characterised as being affected by the reality of being in government and how you have such great expectations. Then you win this stonking majority. And so you think, wow, it's going to be like 1997. I think last year was a reflection of the recognition that it most certainly was not 1997. And I think this year is a reflection that's probably not 1992 either. So we're...
Not 1992 in what sense?
In the sense of either having lost an election or being the government that is never going to possibly recover and you're just completely doomed. I think it was somewhere in between, somewhere in between the two. I think it was a recognition of the fact that, yes, there are challenges ahead, and some of those challenges are extremely large, but at least they have an idea of the challenges and really know what they have to do.
Olivia, was it fine?
I agree it was fine. I think that the conference this year, for the people there, had the benefit of clarity. Every speech was threaded through with this idea that our primary competitor is the Reform Party. We've got a few years before the next election to turn this around, and everything has to be about drawing a distinction between Labour and Reform. So not upbeat, but at least clear, whereas last year there was quite a lot of nervousness in the air and a sense that there were kind of looming challenges coming. I agree with Joe, the reality of government was setting in. Now that seems to have passed. And instead of looking back and being frustrated at the public services, the issues, the problems that they inherited, they're looking forward to the competition in the future. And they see that competition as not with the Conservatives, but with Reform.
Joe, they've comprehensively broken the taboo on mentioning your rivals. They're mentioning them, it felt like, in every speech. What do your numbers tell you about the threat that Reform poses?
Well, Reform certainly pose a threat. But I think to put this whole discussion in context, I think it's really important to think about the issue of uncertainty, because we've heard a lot over the last year, really, about lots of things that would happen if certain scenarios occurred, lots of things that will happen because of what the numbers are showing, etc., etc. But my job as actually a research professional, a lot of the time, is about conveying uncertainty. And I think that's particularly important in this context. The Labour Party has an enormous majority, and so we assume that it's presumably going to be 3.5 years until the next general election. It's within the last 3.5 years that Boris Johnson was giving talks about how he had plans for a third term as Prime Minister. So a lot can change in 3.5 years.
All right, let's grant you that, grant you as much uncertainty as you want. But what are the numbers saying about Reform at the moment?
The numbers are showing that Reform are consistently ahead and well ahead of the polls. They've been ahead in every published poll since May. They had a strong local elections. The expectation are that they will have strong elections next year in Wales and Scotland and other areas. And so the lead of 6, 8, 10 percentage points, sometimes more among outliers, is definitely good news for them. But if you were being positive about it from a Labour perspective, you would perhaps look during conference and think, well, they're not growing their lead. They might even be falling back a bit. In actual fact, I imagine that's probably just the fluctuation of these things. But the long-term trend, it tends to be with reform one of leaps, but then plateaus. And so if you're Labour, you think, well, maybe there isn't another leap to come. Maybe this is it now, and we just need to consistently and repeatedly break into that lead and reduce it.
Do your numbers show that they've got a grip on a block of supporters who really did back Labour in the past, particularly in the famous red wall seats?
At the moment, there has been some shift from Labour to Reform. Up until really sort of just before the local elections, maybe sort of January this year was the beginning, I would say that Reform's growth was characterised mainly by Conservatives shifting to Reform. And that is still the case. There's a reason why the Conservatives are on such low numbers compared to Labour. But it's certainly the case that among certain demographics, and some of those, yes, are in certain areas of the country, they have moved to Reform. But of course, the big question is, have they moved permanently, or have they simply abandoned the government that they see as not helping them? I mean, could be both, of course, but that really is the big question for the next 3.5 years. And then, of course, there's the question about, okay, well, if people do then go back from Reform, will there be differential return, if you like? Will the Conservatives who have moved really stay with them, whereas former Labour supporters are more likely to move back to the government? Again, we don't know, but that's one of the important questions that nobody knows the answer to.
Olivia, just picking up your point about Labour trying to differentiate itself from Reform, do you think that it managed to do that? I'm thinking of the way that Reform obviously has had an awful lot to say on immigration, but on to the extent it has an economic policy, has in some respects planted itself what you might say is way to the left of Labour, saying not only do we want to get rid of the two-child benefit cap, but all kinds of other things, lots of spending.
I think this is because Reform major so much on immigration, and that dominated headlines over the summer. That paid off for them in terms of political momentum. At the end of the summer, we saw them doing well in polls, as Joe has said. But if you look at other policy areas, it's fuzzier what they have to offer and in what ways they would really deal with the kind of trade-offs that Labour are now dealing with in government that led to that sense of nervousness and concern that Joe and I both sensed last year at their first big post-election party conference. In their manifesto, Reform set out a plan that suggests they would be going for about £90 billion of tax cuts and £50 billion in new spending. Some of the immigration plans that they set out in the past couple of months, including their plans to build new bases to house asylum seekers, deport potentially up to 600,000 people over the course of a parliamentary term. That may also imply a lot of new spending. It's not clear what their fiscally credible pathway would be to this. So they sort of offer this very...
You're putting it quite generously, because I think they haven't even got to that point. They're making their declarations at this point.
Yeah, and the exact issues that have troubled this government, which is the UK is in a tight fiscal bind. We have very high levels of public debt. Much of that public debt is owned by foreign bondholders. And if it doesn't look like we're on a credible path to paying it back over time, in short, they will sell it or they will not continue to back Britain as a going concern. This is the Liz Truss problem. Reform's plans currently don't look like they deal with that trade-off at all. In fact, they worsen it, they intensify it. And if you look at some of the other big issues that this government has faced in its first year and a bit, particularly the international ones, the increasing unreliability of the US, for example, questions about where the Russia-Ukraine war is going, it's difficult to see, to put it mildly, what Reform's policy would be. You know, Reform was
Except
originally...
that they've expressed, or Nigel Farage has expressed, an affinity for things Trumpian.
He has. And I think other leaders and parties around the world who have relied on this idea that they have close personal ties with Trump have found in this second term that that doesn't always pay off as a strategy. Ultimately, America First it's there in the name, a self-interested approach. Leaders like Narendra Modi have run aground at having relied on having close personal ties to Trump. And of course, if Reform formed the next government, Trump presumably would not be in power by then. Now, maybe it would be a J.D. Vance America.
Very good point. I'm almost thinking of Trump eternal at this point, but he won't be. So just on this point, Joe, of differentiation between Labour and Reform, what about immigration? The big reshuffle, and there were a lot of Labour MPs very scathing at this party conference about that reshuffle. But the point of this reshuffle to many people seemed to be to put Shabana Mahmood in as Home Secretary and to take immediately this much tougher line on immigration. But there, Labour doesn't seem a world away from what, in tone at least, from what Reform is saying.
Immigration is a really complicated subject, and you can look at it at the top level, and indeed your strategy can be based on top-level narratives and vibes politics, as the kids with What I Am Down would say.
Would they really? Right.
But it is more...
Depends which kids. You're right.
Correct. It is more complicated than that. We asked about the importance of immigration to voters, and we found that the proportion of respondents who place immigration and asylum as an issue in their top three has risen significantly since the start of the year. 49%, so nearly half of people place immigration and asylum in their top three issues facing the country. And this is an important distinction. Now, that has risen from 29% in January, so big uptick. And among Reform supporters, it is the number one issue, whether that's people who currently support Reform or people who previously voted Reform, it's number one. But among the general public, it's the cost of living that's the number one issue. And I think that Labour has to do something about Reform, and through that it has to do something about immigration. But actually, I think the better way to tackle Reform is through economic policies and actually economic success.
Really,
the difficulty they have
really
is they haven't had any. Because when you ask people about the most important issues, not facing the country, but facing you and your family, just over 1 in 5 people, 21%, say immigration and asylum. They place in that top three. That's compared to 63% who say the cost of living. Even among Reform supporters and voters, the most important issue facing you and your family, which of course historically is what people have voted on, it's the economy, it's not asylum and immigration.
So why do you think immigration polls so highly to the extent it does, as you've described? Is it the small boats, the very photogenic spectacle of people coming off the borders not being closed? Is it the big number tally that comes out every year, of which much is legal migration? Is it the sense of the courts not treating asylum seekers in the way they might British citizens, or seeming to indulge their cases that are brought there, and the sense of being bound to international conventions that have been reinterpreted over the years? Well,
the answer is yes.
It's all of these.
It's all of these things,
right.
But crucially, it's all of these things and it's none of these things. Because most people, the general public out there, are not paying close attention to the specific policies, the specific details, or anything. Not even specific news stories.
The numbers are too big.
It's a broad understanding. They believe that the number of people coming to this country should be reduced. I mean, that's a long-standing situation, and that really hasn't changed very much at all. Consistently, around 7 in 10 support a cap on the maximum number of people legally allowed to come here, and more than half believe that the number coming should be decreased, not even kept the same, but actively decreased. But I think for me, one of the most important findings in our poll was the fact that 48% of people, so nearly half, believed that a majority of the people who came to live and work in the UK last year came here illegally. Around a third,
which is not true.
Which is not true. I mean,
so what is the number of the proportion of legal?
Well, here's where it gets interesting. There is no actual published figure of the number of illegal immigrants to this country, but all the estimates that the government have, or indeed all the estimates the government publish, suggest it is significantly lower than 1/2, and certainly not a majority. And yet, half of people, nearly, believe that people come here illegally. A third believe the majority come here legally, and the rest don't know. That, to me, demonstrates that immigration for a lot of people is about things like the rule of law, fairness, competence of the government, the ability of the government to deliver. Immigration
public services,
exactly
quality of public services.
Immigration is a
level of tax.
Immigration
all
is
this kind
a
of
front and center proxy for all of these things. And so, deal with immigration, and grow the economy, and you're doing fine. The problem is, both of those are really difficult things when you're in government. They're much easier to deal with when you're opposing the government.
You can wave flags, though Labour was doing that as well, and shout all kinds of things. We'll come on to the economy in a moment because it is hanging over all of this and all these party conferences. But I'm intrigued. Olivia, you were mentioning Trump and foreign policy in general. And apart from our marvellous events, there wasn't much mention of foreign policy, was there? And certainly not in Keir Starmer's speech. He's done well in some respects in his relations with Trump and getting an EU deal through. But there was a sense that Labour isn't going to thank him for that. Indeed, some hold all those air miles against him.
Absolutely. And it seems there is currently a bit of a disagreement in government about whether it's a problem that Keir Starmer is seen to be a leader who spends a lot of time overseas dealing with overseas issues. On the one hand, when you look at polls, particularly surveys that deal with public opinion on foreign policy, people tend to credit Starmer that he's been dealt a difficult hand. They recognise that Trump is a tough counterpart to deal with. Some people think Starmer is overly friendly or overly concerned with not offending the Trump administration, but quite a decent chunk of people also think that he handles that government well. And some of the moments when this government have looked really assured have been on foreign policy issues. If you think of immediately after the election when they hosted all the European leaders for the European political community, meeting, as you say, that run of trade pacts and deals when they got off pretty lightly on the US tariffs, agreed the trade deal with India, agreed the reset that reduces some of our trading frictions with the EU, or should if those agreements come to fruition.
So he's done a lot there. What about Gaza? I'm interested because he departed from the US. He's recognised Palestine, the kind of thing that people who go to the Labour Party conference care immensely about in general. Do you think he gets thanked for that?
Well, the issue is, while people do recognise some of those other successes, as you say, it's Gaza and the Middle East that tend to cut through as the foreign policy issue that most people care the most about, particularly Labour's constituency. This government has differentiated itself in some ways from the previous government on this issue. They've partially banned some arms export licenses to Israel. They've put sanctions on some individuals in the Israeli government, and they just recently recognised a state of Palestine with some other countries, which, as you say, is significant because it breaks with the US. Trump even acknowledged it in the press conference at the state visit as one of the areas where the UK differs. And I think that is a bit of a demonstration of the UK and some other European countries being prepared to break with the US on this issue, seeking to bring to bear a bit more influence on Israel's conduct of the conflict and on the future trajectory of what will happen. But I think the difficulty here is this is a polarizing issue. It's tough to get credit for charting a kind of careful middle path.
Those who want UK to recognise Palestine, probably many of them want it to go further.
And many of those people might find some of the parties to Starmer's left more appealing, right? The Greens have a new leader, and even the Liberal Democrats have put forward a much clearer position on this. Ed Davey, their leader, is clearly seeing that there's a gap in UK politics for somebody to be seen as to be anti-Trump in their politics and to champion that concern about Gaza and about Palestine. So, as Joe was saying, this is kind of a tough voter coalition for Labour to keep together in all kinds of ways. And it's true on foreign policy issues too, because you have parties to the right who are much more Trumpian, much more prepared to pick up that sort of populist right banner. And you have parties to the left who are, in a way, have the freedom to be much more anti-Trump and oppose those forces in global politics much more, whereas Starmer is in government and has the concern of worrying about all of the UK's security ties with the US.
The people who might thank him for that are perhaps some of the quieter ones. Let's take exactly that point and turn it on to the economy, because that hung over this whole conference. The budget is on November 26th. I've lost track of the number of Labour ministers who said on air, including the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, well, I can't, of course, comment on the budget, which is all these weeks away. But if there was a turning point in the Labour government's favour in the conference, it seemed to me the backlash against Andy Burnham, the supposed insurgent mayor of the Greater Manchester region, the backlash against his comment that let's just ignore the bond markets, because that was such a point of unreality, a Liz Truss, if you like, challenge to the fact that the UK is borrowing an awful lot of money, that it allowed the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to say, look, we have to be sensible. But where do you think, Joe, they ended up after this conference? Because they really do have this very difficult budget coming down the line.
We talk a lot in polling terms about turning points, but actually turning points are vanishingly rare.
Have I misused that, that technical term?
Well, we make the distinction between turning points and talking points, and we never know whether something is one or the other until afterwards.
I stand corrected, at least for 6 weeks.
L-shaped trends and V-shaped trends are what we're looking at, or just flat lines. Will this make a difference? It has the potential to do so. But what makes a lasting difference is not what is announced, because most people won't be paying attention to the detail. And it's not even what actually happens in terms of GDP or unemployment or inflation, most importantly. Instead, it's about the perception that people have of the economy, their own personal economic expectations and their own personal economic judgments. And I think it's unlikely that, given the constraints the Chancellor is operating under, and you can argue whether those constraints are too tight or not tight enough, etc., but given the constraints that have been repeatedly announced as constraining the Chancellor, I think it's difficult to see what changes Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, could announce in the budget that would have a lasting positive impact on people's personal expectations, at least in the short to medium term.
In what sense, though? I mean, she's got to raise more money.
Yes.
And there are many, many people who would like her to make some savings as well, though they don't include all the Labour MPs. And here, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have stumbled already in trying to trim the benefits bill. But are you saying that nothing she can do is going to please many people because it's raising taxes or it's cutting spending?
Yeah, yes. If you have placed constraints on yourself that mean it's very difficult to cut taxes, it's very difficult to significantly boost spending.
Yeah, they're not proposing to cut taxes, so they may raise them.
Yeah, exactly. If you can't cut taxes, if you can't boost spending, if you can't point to something that will boost growth or cut unemployment, and crucially, if you can't announce something that you either believe genuinely or at least pretend to believe will cut the cost of living, it's difficult to see how that will bring about a significant lasting change in people's expectations. Now, that doesn't mean that that won't occur further down the line, or indeed that the budget next year might, because of the tough decisions now, to use the old cliche, because of the tough decisions now, perhaps next year, that doesn't mean that a year or 2 years out from an election, there couldn't be changes. But at the moment, it's difficult to see that. And that's a problem for the Labour Party, because, as I say, it's the economy and specifically the cost of living that remains so important.
Let me ask you whether there is a constituency of any size for a cut in spending. And I'm asking that because I'm thinking of all kinds of rather wistful columnists at the moment, Janet Ganish in the FT, saying, where is the party? And will the Conservatives ever stand up for cutting the size of the state and cutting spending again? Matthew Syed in the Times saying, I'm joining the Conservatives. A surprise to some of his friends, he explained, but saying, I want a party that will cut some of what feels like out-of-control spending. Do you see in the polls at all a sense that there is somewhere a body of people who will back that? I'm also looking at the front of the Daily Express, which obviously leans right in its politics, and a big interview with Kemi Badenoch saying, I can clean up the almighty mess as next Prime Minister.
There is a constituency support, and it's around about sort of 1 in 6 people. So 1 in 6 people would favour cutting taxes and cutting spending, but the cutting spending being the main focus of that. But that's dwarfed by the number of people who believe that actually taxes and spending should be kept where they are, or, which is the most popular view, or that they should be increased. Now, that's very much the minority view, that taxes and spending should both be increased. The difficulty is that what may happen, of course, is that taxes go up and spending is reduced as well. And so that's the worst of both worlds.
The worst of both worlds for people, but the best of both worlds for the national finances.
Yes, but it's not the national finances that vote for the election. It's the people. And when people say they want spending cuts, they usually mean that because they want it accompanied by cuts in taxes. And so
the national finances don't vote. You're absolutely right. But coming back to this question of the bond markets, they do vote in the sense of pricing the debt that Britain has and where it's paying quite a high rate at the moment.
Yes, and obviously that has long-term implications on a whole host of elements of the economy. But as I say, that's not how people view it. People will not be thinking, I wonder how this budget impacts on the bond markets. They'll just be thinking, what does this mean for me?
I'd be surprised, having said all that, whether the bond markets come up as you do these polls at all.
Yes, exactly. And it's not something here. But what's interesting about the budget, particularly nowadays, whereas in the past, when I used to come home from school and turn on the TV only to find that particular day children's television had been cancelled and the budget was on, in those days, before Parliament was even televised, the budget was announced that day, and we would all find out. Nowadays, you could just announce the budget as the markets open as a press release because it's leaked so much in advance.
And in fact, there is a good argument and advanced by many other think tanks of a more economic flavour than us that it should be announced and debated ahead of time.
Yes, but what's interesting about all of this is that increasingly nowadays when we see responses from the public to the budget, it tends to be responses to the one story that sticks out. Pastygate being the obvious example from the Conservative government.
Pasty,
Yes.
George Osborne, the tax on yeah. I thought for a moment you said pasta, and I was worried I'd missed a whole scandal. But,
it may be Pastygate this year, but no, Pastygate previously. That was what became the big thing that everyone was concentrating on, and sometimes these can be deliberate, sometimes they're accidental because the government hasn't identified this specific group that will be affected by this. But I always look for what's the one story, if any, that really cuts through from the budget, and is that a positive or a negative thing? And so you could, if you're Rachel Reeves, and if you're particularly lucky, have a budget that actually is pretty downbeat and negative in terms of the finances. But the one thing that cuts through is actually a good news story and people become more positive. But as I say, it would take as much luck as it would judgment.
So, Olivia, as we come towards the end of this, I'd love you to broaden this out for us. I mean, Britain is a country from this portrait that is struggling with its national finances, and the voters don't want other things that, for example, the Conservatives might stand up for, which is cutting spending and so on. And you've got a version of this with its own wrinkles in France and indeed in Germany as well. Where do you think this is going in terms of the politics?
Well, as you say, I think the difficulty that the Conservative Party are currently in, and it will be very interesting to see what the mood at their conference next week is like. We can discuss whether that's about their leader or about the politics of the moment, but there's a broader trend here, which is it's very difficult to pull together a voter base that is interested in that kind of centre-right, small state proposition. And actually, I think this has longer running roots to pick up on Joe's point about the appeal of reform, the appeal of a party that proposes being extreme on immigration, but seems to be, in terms of the policies they set out, pro a bigger state in some ways, pro more government spending and more tax cuts, appears to appeal to the coalition of voters who voted for Brexit, who voted to leave the EU, and polls, surveys, studies suggest did so because they wanted to reduce or control immigration. But that voter coalition who wanted that was matched in a kind of unhappy marriage with advocates for that project who didn't see it as a migration project at all, who actually perhaps saw it as a deregulatory small state project, Singapore-on-Thames. Joe mentioned how quickly Boris Johnson's voter coalition fell apart, perhaps because that government didn't actually offer those voters what they were looking for. And those voters are kind of looking for a different option now, and it might be reform. Although it depends, I think, a lot on whether reforms seem too extreme. The migration policies they've announced in the past few weeks, particularly repealing indefinite leave to remain, putting people's settled status here in doubt, is more extreme than proposals we've seen in the past from other parties. But I think you're right that the UK to some degree has these trends in common with other Western European democracies. And governing parties who end up having to explain or defend to voters these trade-offs, demographics suggest that barring other approaches or solutions which don't seem forthcoming, immigration is necessary when you have aging populations, bigger welfare states to replace people in the workforce. We have calls to spend more on defence, which suggests we might need to cut our sails in other areas. But none of these trade-offs are easy, and none of them are particularly appealing to voters, and you don't win a lot of points for explaining them bluntly to voters or suggesting that choices need to be made. And I think into that gap, more extreme parties are filling that gap in the UK and, as you rightly say, in other European democracies too.
I think Olivia is absolutely right about this. If you look at immigration and if you look at the economy, for many voters, these are symptoms of a wider problem. And Brexit was another example of that. Brexit, as we know, was about so much more than simply Britain's relationship with the European Union. It was about a cohort of people who are dissatisfied, distrusting, and disapproving, not just of individual politicians or political parties, but of the political system in general. And reform and their incarnations before that did not create this wave of dissatisfaction, but they're doing a really good job of riding it into the beach. And immigration problems are an example of that. Economic problems are an example of that. But as I say, they are symptoms of the wider problem. And this problem is by no means unique to Britain. And it crosses across the traditional left-right spectrum. If you look at last year, we had so many elections across so many different countries. And as far as I know, in all but one of them, in those many different countries across the world, in all but one of them, the incumbent government lost vote share. And in the majority of those elections, the incumbent government was thrown out. Left, right, centre, whatever it was, there was a rejection against incumbency. And now a lot of those governments that are coming in...
Endless disappointment.
Yeah, exactly. Except in Mexico, the one country where the incumbent government was able to increase its vote share. But yeah, take your pick. Of all the countries that had elections last year, the incumbent suffered, almost always getting thrown out. And look at what's replacing them. Those new parties are suffering themselves. And it may be that reform's success is replicated across other countries because of this wave of dissatisfaction, distrust, and disapproval, which the Conservatives were not able to deal with effectively when they were in office, and that Labour are not, at least as yet, being effective to deal with. And what I think Labour are hoping, and was clear at the conference, is that they realise that's an issue, but what they want to do is present the choice as between reform, who they will characterise as too extreme, and themselves, so that they're hoping that people will vote for them, even if it means holding their nose, because the stench of reform, if you'll pardon the expression, is simply too strong.
Reform won't pardon it, but I will for these purposes. You put it beautifully, but the question still hangs there of whether voters are just so impatient of what governments are doing that they will keep throwing them out and searching for a new one, or whether they are prepared. We get back to the famous cliches to hear the hard truths, the hard lessons, whatever you want to say, that governments say about what they have to do. We're going to have to stop there. There's much more to say, and we do have the Conservative conference coming up. I just want to flag up, arm's length from our discussion here, but one thing to look out for on our website, which is our big Iraq conference this year. We have it every year, but I've thought of it even more with all the news about Tony Blair potentially being on the board of peace, if there ever is such a thing in Gaza, because obviously his joining with the US led to that invasion and upheaval in Iraq. But it is one of the things Chatham House does best, I think, of looking systematically and persistently what makes a country run very slightly better. And while there is lots of worrying news always out of Iraq, there is also much positive that people are managing to do there, and Baghdad full of cranes as we speak. So I offer you that as one thing to look for of how countries can manage to work and govern their way out of really dire predicaments. We are, though, going to have to stop there. Thank you very much to Joe Twyman, Olivia O'Sullivan. Thank you very much for listening. See you next week.